All right, welcome back, everyone. We are going to head right back into the next panel of the third annual virtual TSM conference, Redefining Recovery. As always, I am Jenny Williamson, Executive Director of the C3 Foundation, and I am glad to have you guys out there with us today. So this conference is available to view and to participate in for free, thanks to our two co-headline sponsors, Ria Health and Work It Health, and our panel sponsor, Paragon Health Partners and Norberto Vargas, MD, board certified in addiction medicine. If you would like to support the work of the C3 Foundation, there's a donation link in our profile, and we have a timer that will also drop a donation link into the chat during the broadcast. Also, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to live tweet our conference with the hashtags Redefining Recovery and Options Save Lives. It's a great way to amplify the impact of the conference. Our next presentation comes from Dr. Alex Lee, who will speak about finding resiliency through TSM. Dr. Alex Lee is a doctor of social work and licensed clinical social worker with over 15 years of experience in designing, facilitating, teaching, and evaluating innovative programs based on science for individuals, families, and organizations. He is currently the VP of Care Innovations and Director of Coaching at Ria Health. Here, he scaled the program using naltrexone and other medications to address alcohol use across 40-plus states. He has also successfully scaled the TSM program using virtual health in Canada as well. Dr. Lee, welcome to the conference. I'm going to go ahead and hide my video so that you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you so much for everyone out there at C3 Conference. Such an honor. This is my second time presenting. I presented the first time last year and I had such an amazing experience and everything like that. So my presentation is really kind of just finding resilience or resiliency through TSM and just helping people be much more aware of things and how do we work with all the different interplays that has been happening going on. In terms of the agenda, here's like my general presentations in terms of what I wanted to discuss and everything. But before I go into that, I always say, like, while I'm a doctor and I've done this for about 15 years, I really don't know much about TSM. The people who really know it are people like you who have the lived experiences, who are coming in here, informing me, what's the best way to do TSM and how alcohol has impacted your day-to-day lives. So thank you so much for sharing your stories, for your bravery, for coming up, for showing up consistently day to day. I know it's not easy, especially right now during this, I was going to say post-pandemic, but I don't know what a post-pandemic inflation type of thing is. A very different world, but it's also something we will kind of weave in to see how we can find opportunities to not just help people thrive with TSM, but just general thriving and their overall well-being and everything. Jenny kind of gave me my spew and everything like that. I'm a VP of Care Innovation and Director of Coaching at Ria Health, total TSM experience, about 5+ years. I can say at least this year I lost all the COVID weight and everything. I think last year and everything, my face was a little bit bigger, but I think with healthy habits and everything, I was able to get back to how I look like, hopefully with this photo that I took about 3 years ago and everything. But other things I always like to say, I have domestic and international experience with TSM, but technically it was just in Vancouver, just a little bit north of the US border. So it's kind of a cop-out in some ways. But again, everyone out there is really informing me and helping me with TSM, but thank you so much. So let's take it away in terms of the next steps of basically where we are at. And I also put a little bit more time for Q&A, because one thing the feedback that I got from last year was like a lot of more questions to application and things like that. And a lot of times with these conferences or these workshops or webinars, it's a lot of information, or what I call drinking out the fire hose a lot of times. But then what we want to do is really digest and give some really practical tools to the audience member. But in terms of where we are in 2022, where we are at, what we are starting to see is, first on the top left, is that we are seeing much more alcohol use disorder. And I think it has manifest really in a very unfortunately wicked way with the pandemic, with inflation, with all of these going on. We've seen things on the news cycle, seeing much more higher rates of cirrhosis, people using alcohol. Makes perfect sense during the pandemic when it first hit in 2020 and of course in 2022. But of course, it's a very different world. People are returning to work. People don't know what's going to happen with their kids. People don't know what's going to happen with COVID. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And unfortunately, what we're seeing much more is a much more ingrained usage of alcohol use and more diagnosis of alcohol use disorder, more than I have ever seen in the last, 5 to 10 years, unfortunately. Now, the good thing of it is when we switch up is like naltrexone is actually much more available now. So that's a good thing. That's what we want. I always tell people like access. You can get it right now with your primary care provider with programs such as Ria Health or Work at Health. There's a lot of other coaching models too, as well too. So it's much more accessible right now, which is a really good thing. And the other thing too, what we're seeing is naltrexone along with other medications too, as well, using the best of science, such as naltrexone and gabapentin, naltrexone and perhaps baclofen or topiramate, especially when we see a lot more complexity, which leads unfortunately to the next thing is that we're seeing back in more complexity. I'm starting to see right now very rarely that it's just TSM alone with wanting alcohol use. Now it's just more just like with sleep issues, with trauma, with I'm at home being a single mom. I have all these stress issues and other things with fighting with my significant other. And it's just a lot of times when I do a lot of these consultations with providers or things like that, they're like, well, how do I just keep it only with TSM? How do I just make them just, take one pill, before and all the other stuff, let's just not deal with it and everything. And the whole point of today's presentation is like, let's create some practical steps or at least a lens to how do we deal with it. And it's really trying to understand it. And really it's an opportunity to build much more resiliency. And that goes into the last bubble point is that it's a lot of tailoring right now. Again, I think in the early 1990s with TSM, what we saw was like, here's the medication, but now we're seeing much things like TSM for women, TSM for certain cultural groups, TSM for the military, TSM for working professional, TSM for sleep issues. And that's really what we want. And it's starting to build this bigger TSM type of community, and people can actually reach a lot of good information online. It's much more accessible, and that's what we really want, because it always goes back to access. Now, in terms of the outcomes of today, what I really want is more of a contextualization of TSM, providing opportunity for insight, so that we have much more these aha moments. And not just for me, like even though I have a doctorate, it's like really people with doctorate, I'll just say we only know about maybe 5 or 10% of really what's going on. But really for practitioners out there, for consumers out there, for audience members, like they're able to say, I can see like this is an opportunity now to really kind of weave in TSM. And really what I want is really very practical next steps to really that we can help each one are out and also our community as well. And that's really what I hope of today's presentation will be. Now, in some of the common scenarios, like what I've seen is that, especially for clinicians or coaches or something in between that, is that, they get the naltrexone and, in 3 months, they're just like, well, they're taking it, but they're not seeing any sort of results. But then there's all these other things that's going on, as I mentioned, sleep, stress, they just don't seem as motivated and everything like that. But again, I really want us to see that as an opportunity to really kind of weave TSM back in and really transcend that. And what we want to do is address some of the psychodynamic items too as well. And I don't mean like doing therapy, but at least kind of understand and normalize that and allowing that space to happen. I think as practitioners or even people who are on TSM, they think they have to be a certain criteria for it to work and everything. And I always tell people, it's like, well, you know, we're human beings, you know, we don't fit in a box. We're not going to be like, we need to only drink X, Y, and Z, or we have to have X, Y, and Z for it to work and everything like that. At the end of the day, we want to be able to incorporate these things and provide some stuff. Other things too, how to apply various tools and why we should apply for various tools. You know, I think everyone out there have understand that there is this relationship, for example, alcohol and sleep. But then when we add in sleep hygiene, everyone's kind of like, well, that's not my expertise. You know, it's like, that's just not really what I do and everything, but it's really seeing that again as an opportunity. And what we want to do is basically fully integrate it, not just an introduction of sleep hygiene, but then how do we tie things in? So let's say when people are reducing their alcohol use with naltrexone, but then those triggers for wanting to sleep, because let's say you have a better presentation, being able to see that as an opportunity to, okay, why don't we just practice some good sleep hygiene together instead of going back to that alcohol unit or drink or so forth. Because a lot of times, you know, while physically and physiologically those cravings are gone, psychologically it's still there. Those memories are still there, and that's something that I hear a lot from individuals who are on TSM in 1 to 3 months and everything, but then seeing those as an opportunity. And also, again, allowing space. I think one thing I've seen with a lot of individuals is like this left should. It's like, oh, I shouldn't feel this way or things like that. But just saying like, hey, you know what, let's create this space. Perfectly normal. A lot of times drink behaviors and everything that's kind of ingrained, it's really it's embedded in our head, and it's really hard for it to go out, and we have a lot more compassion and allowing space for it. So where does this come in is basically what I want to do is basically resiliency and the capacity to overcome. So a lot of times what we really should start to see is that when people get their naltrexone and then we have that 1 to 3 months and they're really building that momentum, and it's only normal that there will what I call these uh-ohs. Okay, sleep issues are coming in, stress issues are coming in, relationships issues are coming in, but see that as really as a trajectory or springboard to capacity to overcome, to not just further drill down on TSM, but further drill down on healthy behaviors. And ultimately what that does, it builds healthy habits and healthy outcomes. So think of it this way, you're taking TSM and you're able to reduce your alcohol use. And of course that gives you a much more better well-being, but then also you learn things to find ways to self-soothe. And when you find things to self-soothe, you're not doing maladaptive type of coping skills, such as going to an unhealthy network or emotional eating or things like that. So what ends up happening is that people feel more confident because they're able to get TSM under their belt, but then also these other healthy habits. And ultimately what it becomes these protective factors for future situation. Let's say people go to a bar or things like that, and they start to realize that you know what, I not only have TSM under my belt, but I also have all these other healthy habits. I feel much more confident. I'm not scared about going to weddings or happy hours or things like that. That's really what we're trying to do. So now resiliency, there's a lot of definitions out there. As someone who's also have researched in resiliency since 2010, for every definition, I get a conflicting one and things like that. So, but to simplify it for today, you know, let's just bring it down to 3 things. One is really kind of advancing, that you have a vision, like where you really want to go and everything. And also it despises any sort of barriers and things like that. You're very goal directed and you're able to move on. You know, the thing is, when you think about something in 3 months, there's going to be barriers. That's perfectly normal. There's no such thing as a path of least resistance. But then what all the data have shown on resiliency is that these barriers, these items, they actually build and fuel things. And this goes back to the last part about adversity, being able to roll with it. Resiliency happens in spite of adversity. let me repeat that again. Resiliency happens in spite of adversity. A lot of times our society thinks like, if I have no stress or things like that, I will be able to just handle anything. But the studies have shown, especially longitudinal studies in 1 to 5 years to 10 years to 30 years, is that what happened was that when people had things that were very difficult, that actually made the resiliency much more higher to be able to make things go further and everything, to basically develop a level of grit. And again, what we've seen with TSM, you need to take it for about 3 to 6 months, and there's always going to be barriers and everything. But then the old thinking was, let's not have those barriers. Let's have people focus only on TSM, take the medication 1 to 2 hours before drinking. But then one thing we start to realize is that, no, you need those barriers. You need to be able to basically be able to overcome it. And how do we incorporate those together so that way people can be much more resilient? And I would say, like, for everyone who I've talked to who've gone through TSM, they really start to realize it's really more of a journey, not a destination and everything. And through all those things that they've gone through, they were actually really grateful, that because they were able to have a deeper level of understanding. They were actually better if they decide to, go in terms of helping other individuals in from a peer format or a clinician or a coach. They understand those day-to-day type of things, and it actually provide them a lot more insight. So when you think about it in this way, these common scenarios that we have is that it's actually much more easier to work with. And so this is something that we should not run away with. We should really just kind of normalize it and be like, you know what, this is going to happen. But now, hopefully after today's webinar and through everyone's thinking and their rich palette of experience with doing TSM, they start to understand, it's like, okay, you know what, I'm able to put all of these things together, very much like a puzzle piece, and it becomes a much more richer type of lens, so that way we know what are some good decision makings that we can do to really kind of help people thrive. Now, so going back to resilience, what is the path out and everything? I would say from what I have seen, and this is not the one and be all one and everything like that. This is only the pathway that I kind of look at. And it's very, what I call muckety muck science and everything, because I'm a science person, but of course that's not going to translate really well. But one thing that we start to realize is that obviously alcohol in the body, what we need is basically different levels of components of things, and we want to be able to address it and not just see TSM as just doing alcohol use. But what we really want to do is what I call the resilient brain and using TSM and everything like that. Now, going back to what we want in terms of building resiliency, what we start to realize in terms of the neuroplasticity is that there's actually really, I would say for simplicity, there's different versions of it, but it's really 4 chemicals out there that really help regulate and help us overcome stress. One is basically dopamine to find pleasure and reward. One is endorphins, and that's just to address pain and stress. And TSM is that's the one that really kind of targets, because when the alcohol you drink, it releases endorphins and it creates that pharmacological extinction. But then again, going back to like, there's other things that we need to basically help overcome and build much more resilient brain. It's things like the dopamine, the oxytocin, things like serotonin and everything. So what we start to realize is that when we're using TSM, what we should start to think about is that when we find other healthy behaviors, like what are some other mechanisms that we can do to produce these chemicals? Again, when we're doing TSM, what are some other ways to produce these natural chemicals and everything? What I've seen a lot was like individuals who do come in for TSM is like while they're using alcohol, and it has been for a while, but then what through my assessment was that a lot of it wasn't really necessarily the best sleep hygiene, and of course that has issues with their dopamine levels, but then also things like they didn't have the really best stress management skills too, as well as using alcohol a lot for stress and everything. And of course we can use naltrexone to reduce the alcohol use, but if you don't teach people stress management skills or assertiveness skills or things like that, you're going to really struggle at that 3 to 4 month mark and everything. And a lot of times one thing I've seen is that people actually went back to alcohol. And again, what we want to do is look at TSM in more of a resilient lens and looking at it beyond a 3 to 5 month mark and really more at a 1 year and a 2 year and everything, go from there. So what is also needed is not just, and Jenny and I kind of talked about this a little bit right before, is that TSM, when people really accomplish it, they really feel good because they're learning, goal setting, going to learning 1 to 5. And it's really technical when you think about it. But then when you get that under your belt, people actually feel good and they really kind of develop that level of resiliency, which is great. But what we should start to do is have programs that address all these other things like stress management, that people are able to identify their stressors and how it impacts you. Self-care, that's always a big thing. And I always say self-care is a very elusive term and everything. What works for me will work differently for another person. Assertive communication, one thing that we start to realize is that we need connection, but then the thing is, the complexity about connection is that people are difficult, perfectly normal, but then how do you navigate relationships? How do you navigate power dynamics? How do you navigate relationships to allow better intimacy and better authenticity and everything? Other things, again, sleep hygiene, I've said it so much and everything, but of course, if people are able to sleep consistently, that actually creates a degree of dopamine. So that's something that we want to do. But we've also have seen the research and people who've obviously, people who are watching, the relationship between alcohol and sleep. A lot of times when people are just drinking for quite a long time, they're sleeping really more on an unconscious level, not necessarily in a deep REM sleep and everything. They really have to relearn. And a lot of times, one thing I've seen with sleep is that when people are reducing alcohol and then they actually have a period of insomnia, but asking people to just kind of stick with it, because that period of insomnia is your brain is rewiring and going back to trying to figure out what are some natural ways to figure out your own dopamine level. Cultivating relationships, how to find a social network. One thing that I realized with the pandemic, it's like we were really, really isolated, and now that we're kind of released and everything, like how do we cultivate relationships, and also what is safe relationships too as well, or I think also for me, one thing that's my security thing. One thing I've realized is that we've been so isolated and doing our interactions with Zoom. And now when we go and meet people at a restaurant, we don't know how to interact or what personal space is or reading social cues. Last thing is also like positive thinking, learning self-compassion, being easy with ourselves. I mean, this is something that I've seen so much. And I'm sure everyone have seen too as well, like, or even they were at that moment, we know that the evidence is there that TSM works, but then it was also working with people with cognitive distortion. A lot of times people didn't really feel like they were deserving of a life outside of alcohol, and that has nothing to do. And you can't just say like, let's keep taking your naltrexone 1 to 2 hours before drinking. This is ultimately what we want to do, is incorporate all these items. But then if we have these things and being able to at least have a good foundation or next step, we start to really find opportunities to help people thrive, to really understand TSM. So how this kind of plays out, and this is kind of a general thing of things. This is just a more simplified things in terms of engagement. And again, one thing I'm really against is kind of the biomedical model. Again, TSM, when it first created, great, groundbreaking, but if you just tell someone to just take the medication at 1 week, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. It's what I call a law of diminishing returns. After a while, people are just not going to just listen and actually stop taking the medication. Think of it kind of like a child telling them to eat broccoli. It works maybe, in the first week or two or things like that. But if you don't change it up or incorporate, other items and why it's beneficial to them or things like that, and really kind of degree of selling, their engagement level actually goes down. So one thing that we start to see is that when you start to add in things like resiliency, things that's really relevant to an individual's life, like let's say stress issue, or they want to develop deeper and meaningful type of relationships, or one thing that I always tell people, this process it goes into iterations. perfectly normal when you come in saying like, I want alcohol, change my alcohol. But then of course, when you're reducing the alcohol, your thinking patterns make sense that it's going to change, and you're going to start to think about other stuff such as better relationships, or thinking about like, oh wow, I didn't realize that I was drinking due to my job. I had a very toxic boss and everything like that. And of course, when you go into a session and then the person's just saying like, are you just taking your TSM, or are you just taking your medication, it's just not going to work. But they were able to weave in, it's like, okay, we have this great insight now, and you're able to master TSM. But I think what you can do with this mastery is also using those skills and that insight to apply for a different job, to find something else too as well. And that's really what we're trying to do here, and trying to incorporate all of these items together. So again, this is kind of a general framework in terms of TSM with kind of sleep, and how do we kind of produce things kind of together. Again, the top part is, just a general TSM protocol that normally a lot of people have done. But again, if we were to incorporate things like sleep to be able to help people increase the level of dopamine, what we really want to do is help people understand what sleep is for them, and providing educational next steps, reviewing some protocols, and highlighting the benefits and the progress, and reviewing it and kind of assessing it and everything. Now, again, first time when you're doing this, you're kind of like, oh, wow, like, how do I even do this? I'm not a sleep hygiene expert or things like that. And you don't have to be. All I'm saying is just like, at least understand how it incorporates, and knowing good foundation, really more on an educational level. A lot of times, one thing people think, and why I love coaching and other different models, is that therapy is good on a one-to-one level, but then there needs to be other tools for people, such as coaches, such as education, such as workshops, such as digital tools. That's this much that translates better and help people get to a clinical outcome. Behavioral change doesn't just happen from a 9-to-5 level. Most of us are reading on our phone at 1 a.m. or something, wanting to know something and everything. And if people don't have certain information, they're just not going to make the behavioral change. But this is a good framework to kind of help people and kind of understand, it's like, okay, let's build up some other dopamine levels, so that we can really get the momentum going with TSM. Another way to kind of look at it is with assertive communication, oxytocin, to basically build deeper, meaningful relationship. I think this is really hard, and this is actually something that's, I would say, out of all the TSM individuals I work with, at least 20 to 30%, of what I have incorporated with a lot of my clients. A lot of times people were drinking due to they didn't feel like they had a fulfilling relationship, or they were avoiding certain topics. But of course, what ends up happening, you're developing these not necessarily healthy relationship habits, and you're actually depriving yourself of oxytocin and everything. So a lot of times when people are getting a certain momentum with TSM, they're reducing alcohol. Let's just fill that gap with some assertiveness skills. Let's just do some role playing. Let's first assess the quality of your relationships, where you feel like you can go to for support, and what are some people who you feel like you can trust, but then you haven't shown a certain vulnerable side, when you be with a stated level of intimacy. And let's just kind of role play that and how that looks like. A lot of times these skills or these tools, people think it's like, oh, I need to gain, I'll do it after TSM or after I get a certain outcome. It's like you can do it actually at the same time, and using these really great progress that you made with TSM, but using that as a launching board to kind of work with other type of skills too as well. And that's really what we want to do here. So again, this is a good framework that people can kind of just see. Feel free to take screenshots too out there in the webinar to see how it kind of works too as well. Other things is positive thinking, that serotonin, being able to have a good relationship with yourself, having a sense of gratitude as well. We know that brings in a lot of serotonin, and when we are able to decrease alcohol, but then able to increase our own serotonin and things like that, it makes us even less reliant on alcohol, and really maintain those outcomes that we got with TSM. But one thing that I've seen a lot with thinking patterns and alcohol use, again, alcohol there's a huge correlation between high alcohol use and basically negative thinking and anxiety. And then when you start to understand it's one of those chicken or egg type of things, and a lot of times what ends up happening is that people are not just consuming high levels of alcohol, but then they also have high levels of negative thinking in terms of things. But then what we want to do is basically, how do we replace those thoughts and make it much more positive, or at least minimum neutral, but then ones we're able to reframe these situations. And this is one framework to basically understand these things. And then we find a really good pathway out of this. And the last thing is, of course, the stress management of endorphins and everything. You know, this is probably one of the biggest things that I've seen people just drink, or at least start to drink, just because it was very stressful for where they are at in terms of their, again, work situation, family responsibilities, basically, or something in between, but they didn't know what stress management was. Things like managing your energy. You know, I always tell people, don't just manage your time, but manage your energy. What are things that really feed you and helps you keep going, but be able to incorporate that. One thing that I've seen a lot is people who come in the beginning of TSM, there was high level of alcohol use, but it was primarily that was their main diet, you know, and of course there's no nutritional value with alcohol. There's no nutrients, but a lot of times when you're able to manage not just your stress level, but also manage your diet too as well, and getting certain nutrients, it ultimately pays dividends. And this is ultimately what we're able to incorporate. But again, what we want to do is take TSM and be able to add these items and really see it as an opportunity at each marks from day 1 to day 30 to day 60, and how do we check in and weave all of these things together. So after seeing some good frameworks, what we start to realize with the alcohol and the body and everything, and how we need a whole cornucopia of things, it starts to become easier, and we don't necessarily just need to just see things from a one-to-one therapy perspective. We can incorporate all of these other items through workbooks, through digital tools, through education, through workshops, and that ultimately brings a lot more accessibility, which is what we want. And we start to see things as more than just TSM, or that it's TSM is really a starting point and it's a gateway for positive change. And that's something that I've always believed in since day 1, before I even got into this type of work. So to review, we have resiliency and TSM and everything. Hopefully this kind of gives like a good type of, again, framework and lens that we start to see that these barriers are really opportunities, and these barriers are really fuel for positive change. We saw some different pathways too as well to kind of just move things forward. There's only about 4, but again, I'm just someone with a PhD. It doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't. But it really, the people who are the drivers of this are people who are watching right now. You know, you guys have so much rich and lived experience, and you are always informing me and what is better and making this. And ultimately, what we want to do, again, integrate to set up for success. I would say, maybe it's because I'm stubborn and everything like that, but a lot of times it's never going to be, here's TSM and stress management. You know, people are going to quote unquote fail, you know, or have these mishaps or things like that. Okay. I say those are really opportunities and lessons learned and everything. No one ever gets it right the first time. And so I think it's really important to see things as a iteration process and manifestation process. If you don't expect at least 3 to 6 types of mistakes, then that really is not, you know, realistic. But then ultimately what we want to do is see these 3 to 6 mistakes, and that it's really a great opportunity to help people thrive and move forward and help promote better understanding with their relationship with TSM, alcohol, and themselves. Again, some possible next step, again, what we want to do is reframe. You know, again, I truly do believe, and I wouldn't be in this type of work if we didn't see things as it's these failures, and it's really kind of an opportunity. What we need to do is tailor to as well. There are so many different population and cohorts and needs. I think it depends on which data you look at, but last data I saw in the United States alone, there's about 40 million people with alcohol use disorder, you know, and that's just basically people who disclose. We know there's a high level of stigma with this, so we know that's even more, and that's not even including people who binge drink. Again, people who binge drink don't necessarily fall in the criteria of AUD, and sometimes that's even more dangerous. So what we need to do is, you know, how do we find TSM and not just make it just more for just people who need, you know, high levels, but then in an early level of where they are in their stages of change and their drinking, but then how we do it for women, for men, for older adults, for college students too as well. And I think that's something that's really big. And how do we make things that's relevant? And again, the other things is we want to integrate these things too as well, integrate it and see that, and not see it as like, oh, we don't do that. Again, 20 years ago in my field, it was like, it was actually really hard to see mental health and actually substance use together. Most people only train in one or the other, and now we're finally there. But about 5 years ago, we did not. Hello? Did I freeze?
Yeah, you froze for a moment, and
okay.
It looks like you're back.
Okay, looks like I'm back. So I think it's my internet where I'm at. I moved to a new place and everything. So where was I? I think, you know, what we saw was we didn't see a lot of integration of things, but now we're just seeing a lot of things kind of coming together, but it's really a great opportunity. In my field, you know, we did not see mental health and technology. You know, they were just two very different spheres. But now with COVID and a pandemic, you know, doing, you know, therapy with Zoom, digital tools, that's just basically the norm and everything. And one thing we've seen with alcohol use disorder, we're going to see a lot of alcohol use disorder and pandemic stress and trauma, you know, and now what we need to do is build TSM to that level to help a lot of individuals. And last thing, it's really just kind of allow, you know, I think this is more on really more of a philosophical, maybe kind of on an individual level. It's like, it's okay to just not know. You know, again, I always tell people, you know, curiosity mind is always the best thing because you're just you're seeing what's out there and everything like that. You know, one of the things I really love about this community and this field, it's like we've changed so much, and that's perfectly normal, but we allow for that, and now it has taken on its own, and it really allowed a community to flourish. We really allow TSM to be very much more accessible. We allow TSM to have ownership with individual, how it changed, and just hearing the stories. And it's not just about their alcohol use, but how people were able to gain a level of creativity, deep, meaningful relationships, and so forth. But that really is, I think, really the first step for change. Really, it's not just about like, here's an evidence-based intervention or things like that. It's really, do we allow for a space for change and everything? Mm-hmm. So again, now we have time for Q&A and everything. So I think we're right on time-ish and everything. I'll start my screen and everything. But again, just want to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart again for allowing me to be here, inviting me to this space and everything, especially among all the experts out there who are watching right now.
Oh, thank you so much for this talk. I think that personally, resiliency is one of those things that is so often underappreciated and overlooked as a skill in recovery. And can you take a moment and just talk about the impact in the clients that you work with? Resilience is the opposite of traditional treatment, which is all about strength. It's about not failing. It's about the perfection of abstinence without any gray area at all. And with the Sinclair Method and harm reduction modalities in general, the fact that alcohol and that substance is still being used, and that it's not a linear progression of reduction, can cause a lot of stress with people. Talk about how your clients react when they finally start to internalize that they don't need perfection, They just simply need to learn how to continue forward and have that resilient mindset in the face of those maybe bad nights or bad weeks.
Yeah, and I think you hit it home. I mean, and I'm glad we're able to have this dialogue. And why my last point was allow. You know, you said the word perfection and everything, but there's no such thing. And then one thing the research have shown, and one thing I've seen with my clients and also with myself in my personal life, is like, you know, life is messy, you know, and if we don't allow that to be to be incorporated, to allow our full selves to be in, I would say, like, you know, it's all, you want to be perfectly imperfect and everything. And a lot of times people think they need to be X, Y, and Z before they do TSM. You know, for everyone who's reaching out there, just want to know that you're not alone on this. But I also have seen behind the scenes, like, people are like ambivalent and thinking about TSM, and they think like, oh, they need to do X, Y, and Z first before they can get it and everything. But a lot of times when you work with a good program or good practitioner, they would be able to allow that space and to be in. But I have seen that with clients, when you allow that space to be in, but then, you know, all the other stuff, like how alcohol has impacted them or made a lot of damages to their family or career life and things like that, and they're just like, I'm just going to do TSM and I'll be fine, but then they don't bring that in, there's a high level of anxiety. And I just want to normalize that, and that it's okay. And you know, we do, a good program will be able to build that level of stress tolerance, and a good provider will be able to do a lot of good internal work to hold space for that. And this is a very human thing. And I think for me, it took me a long time to really understand that. It was, oh, trust me, I was struggling with it, because then, you know, a lot of times our clients are mirrors too of ourselves and what we allow and don't allow. But again, I think that's a very universal and human thing, and I'm so glad you brought that, and that's key to basically this presentation, that we want to build that and say that, you know what, it's okay, but it's also, when you allow that, it allows to build strength. You know, again, that is the key ingredient. Think of it like fertilizer. You know, fertilizer for a plant is, you know, byproducts and all these other stuff and everything, but it really is fertilizer. And this is what we really need to do, and be able to allow that space to be in.
And so one of the other things that I love about resiliency is that it really is a skill, and that if people don't feel resilient, if they don't start the Sinclair Method with a feeling that they are resilient, that's something they can build. Mm-hmm. So we only have a couple of minutes left. Can you talk a little bit about some things that people can do to build their mental and emotional resiliency?
Mm-hmm. I would say, fake it till you make it. You know, a lot of times I get that a lot in terms of like, well, I just don't feel it, or I don't feel motivated. My philosophy is like, I always feel like that's in some ways overrated, you know, because it goes back to the interplay of behavior. You know, in order to get those chemicals going, you need to do the behavior. But then if you're not doing that behavior, you're not gonna get those chemicals. So it's really that chicken or egg type of debate and everything like that. So I always tell people, like, you know what, let's fake it till you make it. Or a lot of times when people think progress is like a light switch or like a linear process, I tell people it really is a spiral staircase. You know, you'll be going, and then you might revisit it, that feeling, but hopefully with, you know, through time, you start to realize that that feeling is less, and that's good. That's progress. You know, progress is never linear. But I always work with clients, well, they're always saying like, well, where's the elevator to this? I was like, there's no elevator. There's only a spiral staircase and everything. And I think, again, having these different lens and these dialogues, and even when we're talking, we're able to laugh about it too as well. That is life, and that is treatment too as well. And we're able to normalize these things. And I always tell people, like, move forward and everything. And before you know it, you know, we're right in the middle of things, kind of like looking at stocks. You know, if we look at it on a daily level, we're going to go insane. But if we look at it on a 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, we're going to see a lot of the growth that we have. So it's always about that consistency and just normalizing a lot of things. We can never eliminate anxiety or frustration or things like that. It's kind of there, but then the more that we normalize it and make it a safe space and get rid of that word perfection, which I really hate, and there's no such thing, and we normalize these experiences, we basically, people are able to reach out for help more, to be able to maintain things more too as well.
All right. Well, and I think we'll go ahead and we'll end on one other piece of advice, and it made me think of it as you were talking about the spiral staircase. I think sometimes people are looking for the elevator, but they find a slide along the spiral staircase. Would you agree that resiliency is the ability to start walking back up that staircase when you've taken the slide all the way down?
Pretty much. And resiliency is really an art form and everything. And again, what we started to realize about resiliency, you need those barriers, you need those uh-ohs, you need those things. If you have something that was frictionless, you actually don't learn and everything. You don't develop a level of grit. So I always tell people to just normalize and see it as really more of a setback, and that this is something that they can overcome with the right tools and time. And if you don't in the current situation, that's perfectly fine. I've never encountered with any clients or even myself personally, it's like sometimes, maybe that answer is not there, but eventually it will come, and be able to trust in that.
All right. Well, our time is up. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and switch over to an intermission so I can get set up for the final panel of the day. So thank you,
so
Dr. Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone out there.